Hello and welcome. Power has a price. Immortality has conditions. And thrones, even divine ones, do not remain occupied simply because their current resident wishes them to. Across the infinite breadth of the multiverse, in realms where reality bends to thought and consciousness shapes existence itself, gods sit upon thrones built from worship, sustained by belief, maintained through the constant attention and devotion of mortals who number in the millions. These are not metaphors. These are not symbolic representations of abstract concepts. In many Dungeons and Dragons worlds, particularly in the Forgotten Realms during certain eras, this represents the literal truth of divine existence. A god is powerful because mortals make them powerful. A god remains relevant because mortals keep them relevant. And when mortals stop paying attention, when worship ceases and belief crumbles, even the mightiest deity discovers that their throne has become terrifyingly, catastrophically empty. The astral plane stretches beyond comprehension, a silver void where thought becomes movement and distance loses meaning. Travelers who venture into this realm report a sensation of timelessness, of existing in a space where past and future collapse into an eternal present. But scattered throughout this infinite expanse, breaking the monotony of endless silver, float objects so massive that they can be seen from distances that would render planets invisible. These are not asteroids. These are not natural formations. These are the corpses of dead gods, bodies the size of mountains or larger, slowly petrifying into stone, monuments to the fundamental truth that divinity itself can fail. The Githyanki built their capital city upon one such corpse. Tunnarath, the greatest city of the Githyanki civilization, sits atop a deity that died eons before the Githyanki ever gained their freedom from mind flayer slavery. This forgotten god possessed 6 arms, each frozen in the moment of death, each limb large enough that entire districts of Tunnarath have been carved into its petrified flesh. The Githyanki hollowed out chambers in its bones. They built streets along its ribs. They established their throne of power in Castle Susurrus, which comprises most of the skull of the dead god, built deep into the bone itself. The Githyanki made a statement that resonates across the multiverse. Even gods can be reduced to real estate. You need to understand how gods function to truly grasp the horror and significance of an empty throne. The mechanics of divine power have shifted throughout the ages of the Forgotten Realms, particularly around major cosmic events. After the time of troubles in 1358 Dale Reckoning, the overgod Io fundamentally changed how deities operate. He decreed that gods must maintain their worshippers and uphold their portfolios, or they will fade from existence. This was not mere suggestion. This was cosmic law, enforced by an entity so powerful that even the mightiest gods are but pieces on his game board. During this era, what scholars call the post-Avatar crisis period, gods derived their power directly from worship. The more mortals who believed in a god, who worshipped that god, who prayed to that god, and organized their lives around that god's teachings, the more powerful that deity became. This was not a gradual, barely noticeable effect. This was fundamental to the structure of divine power itself. A god with 10,000 worshippers was objectively, measurably less powerful than a god with 10 million worshippers. Divine rank categorizes this power into discrete levels, a hierarchy that every deity understands and most mortals ignore. At the bottom exist quasi-deities, beings who possess divine power, but barely qualify as gods at all. They might have a few hundred devoted followers, might be able to perform minor miracles in limited areas, might grant spells to a handful of clerics if those clerics are particularly faithful. Quasi-deities exist on the edge of divinity, one bad generation of worshippers away from fading into obscurity entirely. Above the quasi-deities stand the demigods, entities who command the worship of thousands, who govern narrow portfolios in limited regions. A demigod might be the patron of a single city, the divine representation of one specific craft or art, the posthumous ascension of a legendary hero, whose deeds earned them a spark of divinity. Demigods must work constantly to maintain their worship, to stay relevant to their followers. Because the gap between demigod and quasi-deity is frighteningly small, lesser deities possess more security. They command tens of thousands of worshippers spread across multiple regions or even nations. Their portfolios cover broader concepts that cannot easily be rendered obsolete by changing fashions or technologies. A lesser deity of agriculture will remain relevant as long as mortals need to eat. A lesser deity of storms will maintain worship as long as weather affects mortal lives. But even lesser deities must compete for attention, must work to distinguish themselves from other gods with overlapping portfolios, must constantly demonstrate their relevance through answered prayers and granted miracles. Intermediate deities operate on a scale that most mortals cannot fully comprehend. They have hundreds of thousands of worshippers, sometimes millions. Their divine realms are vast, complex spaces where petitioners, the souls of faithful worshippers who joined their God in death, live out eternal existences shaped by their deity's nature. An intermediate deity of war might maintain a realm of endless glorious battle, where the honored dead fight and die, and rise again to fight once more. These gods have enough accumulated power that they can survive periods of reduced worship, can weather temporary declines in their follower count without immediately fading. greater deities stand at the pinnacle of divine power, commanding the worship of millions, sometimes tens of millions of mortals across multiple worlds. These are the gods whose names everyone knows, whose influence shapes the fundamental nature of reality in their spheres of control. A greater deity of death governs every soul that passes from life, processes them through the afterlife, determines their final destination. Greater deities possess enough stored divine power that they could theoretically survive for extended periods without new prayers reaching their ears. But even they are not truly invulnerable. Even they can fall if the conditions align against them. And above even the greater deities exists Io, the overgod of the Forgotten Realms, an entity so powerful that calling him a god seems inadequate. Io created the entire solar system, known as realm space. He shaped the planets, established the rules by which gods must operate, wrote the tablets of fate that define what portfolios each deity can hold, and how they must maintain those portfolios. Io requires no worship. He draws power from sources beyond mortal comprehension. Some texts suggest he serves a master, an entity even more vast than himself, though this remains one of the great mysteries of Faerunian cosmology. But Io is not benevolent. He is not merciful. He is cosmic law-given consciousness, and when gods violate his rules, he responds with absolute, terrifying authority. The tablets of fate established the framework within which all Faerunian deities must function. These stone slabs, covered in writing that only Io himself can fully read, decree several fundamental laws. First, in the era following the time of troubles, each deity must maintain their worshippers and uphold their portfolios. A god who neglects their followers or abandons their divine responsibilities will fade from existence. Second, no two gods in the same pantheon can possess identical portfolios. When conflicts arise over overlapping domains, one god must fade from the realms, or both gods must merge into a single entity, or they must alter their portfolios sufficiently that both can coexist. Third, the overgod himself controls who becomes a deity and who loses divinity. These rules create a divine ecosystem where competition is constant and failure has permanent consequences. When a god dies, their portfolio does not simply vanish. That collection of domains, those aspects of reality the god governed, must be assigned to someone or something else. Other gods see opportunity. They see domains they can claim, worshippers they can absorb, power they can add to their own. But what happens to the god's divine realm when that god dies? These pocket dimensions, carved from the substance of the outer planes, shaped by the deity's will into reflections of their nature and purpose, do not continue functioning without their creator. The divine realm begins to decay, Structures crumble, landscapes warp and twist. The petitioners who lived there, souls of the faithful dead who chose to spend eternity with their God, start to fade. Some are claimed by other deities with related portfolios who absorb the fallen god's worshippers. Others simply dissolve, their consciousness dissipating back into the raw spiritual energy from which they formed. Consider the followers who remain alive when their god dies. These clerics and priests and devoted worshippers who organized their entire existence around serving a deity suddenly discover that their prayers go unanswered. The divine power they could channel, the miracles they could perform, the connection they felt to something greater than themselves, all of it stops. For many, this is not merely the loss of magical abilities. This is the destruction of their worldview, the shattering of the foundation upon which they built their identity. The mechanics of how gods gain power from worship, as mentioned earlier, have varied across the ages. During certain eras, particularly after the time of troubles, worship was the primary source of divine power. When a cleric kneels before an altar in praise, something flows from that mortal to their deity. It is not physical. It is not a substance that can be measured or quantified by normal means. But during this period, it was real, and it was essential. Based on what scholars have observed, worship may not be the only source of divine power, at least in some cosmological frameworks. Mortals who engage with a god's portfolio, even without formal prayer, could potentially create connections that reinforce that deity's power. A sailor who navigates by the stars might unconsciously strengthen the god of navigation. A warrior who fights honorably might unconsciously feed power to the god of honorable combat. This interpretation would suggest that gods remain relevant as long as the concepts they represent remain meaningful to mortal existence. This means that truly destroying a god requires more than simply killing their physical form or avatar. It requires severing all connections between that deity and mortal reality. The worshippers must stop praying. The portfolios must be claimed by other gods or rendered irrelevant. The very concepts the god represented must cease to matter to mortal existence. Only then, when every thread connecting the deity to reality has been cut, does the god truly die. Their divine essence dissipates. Their consciousness dissolves. Their body, if such a thing exists, is cast into the astral plane to slowly petrify into stone. The world of Athos demonstrates what happens when gods are removed from the equation entirely. In the dark sun setting, there are no deities. Scholars debate whether gods never existed on Athos or whether they were destroyed in some ancient cataclysm, but the result remains the same. Mortals live in a world completely devoid of divine presence. Some sources suggest that primordials, powerful elemental entities from the dawn of creation, defeated whatever gods might have claimed Athos during the cosmic war between primordials and deities that occurred at the beginning of the multiverse. Based on this interpretation, the primordials won on Athos, establishing their dominance over divine entities. Without gods, the people of Athos turned to other sources of power. Clerics draw their magic not from deities, but directly from the elemental planes, bargaining with elemental spirits for power without any divine intermediary. Druids connect to the dying world itself, drawing sustaining energy from what little life remains in the desert wasteland. The Sorcerer Kings, powerful defilers who rule the city-states of Athos, present themselves as living gods, demanding worship and obedience. But they are not true deities. They are mortals, incredibly powerful mortals with lifespans measured in millennia, but still fundamentally mortal. One Sorcerer King, named Dregoth, attempted to become a true god. He studied the deities of other worlds, learning how divine power functions, understanding the importance of worship and belief. He created his own race, the Dre, specifically designed to worship him. He accumulated followers, built temples, performed miracles. He did everything that gods in other worlds do to maintain their power. And yet, according to the lore, it failed. This suggests that Athos itself may reject attempts at apotheosis, that the cosmic conduits allowing gods to draw power from worship simply do not function on this world. This absence creates a society fundamentally different from other Dungeons and Dragons worlds. In most settings, gods serve as a ceiling, an ultimate authority that even the mightiest mortals must acknowledge. But on Athos, there is no such ceiling. Mortals can achieve power limited only by their ambition and the resources available to them. Mortals can become gods in many Dungeons and Dragons settings, though the paths to divinity are neither simple nor safe. Some ascend through the direct intervention of an overgod like Io, elevated to fill a needed role in the divine hierarchy. Others accumulate enough power and worship that they achieve divinity, reaching a critical mass of belief that transforms them from mortal to divine. Still others kill an existing god and claim that deity's portfolio, stealing divine power through violence and ambition. And some gods simply choose a mortal to be their successor, passing on their divine essence before fading from existence. But ascension does not guarantee eternal existence. New gods face the same challenges as old gods. They must maintain their worshippers. They must defend their portfolios from competing deities. They must remain relevant to the mortals whose belief sustains them, at least during eras when worship is the primary source of divine power. And if they fail, if they lose their followers or become obsolete, or simply cannot compete in the brutal ecosystem of divine politics, they too will fall. They too will end up as stone corpses drifting through the astral plane. This is a fundamental truth about divinity in many Dungeons and Dragons settings. Gods are not necessarily eternal. They are not unchangeable. They are not always safe from destruction. They are powerful, yes, immensely powerful, but they exist within systems and constraints that limit what they can do and how long they can survive. The throne sits empty not because no one wants to occupy it, but because even the mightiest occupant eventually fails, eventually falls, eventually discovers that immortality and indestructibility are not the same thing. Section 2. Mystra, the goddess who died 3 times. Magic flows through the multiverse like blood through veins, invisible and essential, taken for granted until the moment it stops. The weave, that fundamental structure through which all arcane power flows, is not a natural phenomenon. It is not some abstract cosmic force that exists independently of consciousness. The weave is maintained by a goddess. Or more precisely, the weave was built by a goddess, maintained by a goddess, protected by a goddess who understood that without her constant attention, without her moment-by-moment intervention, magic itself would tear reality apart. Her name was Mistral. Then it was Mystra. Then it was Mystra again, though a different consciousness wearing the same name. And she has died 3 times, each death reshaping the fundamental nature of magic across Faerun and beyond, each resurrection bringing something changed, something that could never quite restore what was lost. The first death came in the year -339 Dale Reckoning, in the final days of the greatest magical civilization Toril had ever known. Nethril was an empire built on magic so advanced, so powerful, that it makes modern arcane achievements look like the fumbling efforts of apprentices. The Netherese did not merely cast spells. They reshaped reality according to their will. They created floating cities, enclaves the size of kingdoms that hung in the sky, supported by permanent enchantments that had functioned flawlessly for generations. They developed spells of the 10th, 11th, even 12th level, working with magic at scales and intensities that would be considered impossible by later ages. But Nethril was dying. The Faerun, malevolent creatures from deep beneath the earth, had emerged to drain the life from the land. They cast spells of such power that they sucked the vitality from entire regions, transforming lush forests into barren deserts, killing crops, destroying the agricultural base upon which Netherese civilization depended. The Empire's greatest archwizards fought back, creating new spells, new magical defenses, but nothing seemed to work. The Faerun were too powerful, too numerous, too relentless. Karsus, the youngest wizard to ever create his own floating city, believed he had found the solution. He had spent years developing a spell that no mortal should have been able to create. An incantation of the 12th level that would allow him to temporarily merge with the essence of any deity. He called it Karsus's avatar, and he planned to use it to claim the divine power of Mistral herself, goddess of magic, creativity, and knowledge. His reasoning seemed sound, at least to him. If he could become the god of magic, even temporarily, he could reshape the weave to counter the Farim's life-draining spells. He could protect Netheril. He could save his civilization. The fact that attempting this might destroy magic entirely, apparently, did not concern him. Or perhaps he simply believed himself skilled enough to handle divine power. The spell worked. For one brief, terrible moment, Karsus succeeded. He merged with Mistral's divine essence. He possessed her power, her connection to the weave, her responsibility for maintaining the delicate balance of magic across the entire world. He could perceive every spell being cast simultaneously across Faerun. He could feel the weave stretching and flexing as thousands of wizards drew upon its power for their own purposes. And he discovered, in that instant of divine awareness, that he could not handle it. Mistral had been maintaining the weave for millennia. She knew every nuance of its structure, understood how to compensate when one section came under stress, could predict where problems would emerge and address them before they became catastrophic. Karsus had mere moments of experience before everything began to collapse. The weave began to fluctuate wildly. The lands of Netheril and beyond were inundated with a flood of raw magic, which surged and ebbed with far greater power and destructive force than had ever been seen before. Mistral, trapped by Karsus's spell, unable to maintain control of the weave while merged with a mortal consciousness, faced an impossible choice. She could try to wrestle control back from the Archwizard, but that would take time, and time was exactly what Netheril did not have. The floating cities were already beginning to fall. Millions of people were about to die. Or she could sacrifice herself, severing the connection, destroying her own consciousness in the process, but restoring enough stability to the weave that it would not completely unravel and erase magic from existence forever. She chose sacrifice. Mistral broke the link between herself and Karsus. The spell shattered. Her divine essence dissolved, and magic stopped. This self-sacrifice temporarily held all interaction with the weave in abeyance, causing all magic to cease functioning for several minutes. Every spell ended. Every enchantment failed. And without the steady infusion of magic, the floating cities of Netheril plummeted to the ground. Most of Netheril's enclaves crashed and were utterly destroyed. millions died in minutes. An entire civilization, the most magically advanced culture Toril had ever produced, was wiped out in an afternoon. Karsus himself was immediately slain when Mistral sacrificed herself, as her actions broke his link to the magic. His power-engorged body immediately turned to red-hued stone, and he plummeted from the heights of his once floating enclave to the ground. As his body fell, Karsus replayed over and over in his mind the image of Netheral's cities plunging to the ground and shattering, a vision granted to him by his brief tenure as a divine being. But his consciousness did not end. Based on what later sources reveal, Karsus's soul remained bound to his petrified body, aware but unable to move, unable to speak, unable to do anything but think and remember and regret. For thousands of years, this suggests Karsus has existed in this state, trapped in stone, reliving his failure. Mistral died, but magic survived. A contingency she had established activated. Somewhere on Faerun, a peasant girl with the barest magical training woke to consciousness with Mistral's divine essence now residing within her. This girl, who had never cast a spell beyond simple cantrips, who knew nothing of divine power or cosmic responsibility, suddenly possessed the goddess of magic's power. She took the name Mistra, seized control of the weave before it could completely dissolve, and rebuilt it with new rules. No spell above 9th level would function anymore. The kind of magic that had allowed Netheral to build its floating cities, that had enabled Karsus to create his god-merging spell, was now impossible. Mistra made certain that no mortal would ever again possess the tools to attempt what Karsus had done. This first Mistra ruled for over 1,697 years, from -339 Dale reckoning to 1,358 Dale reckoning. She guided magic through the rise and fall of empires, through countless wars and catastrophes, maintaining the weave with skill that mortals took completely for granted. And then came the time of troubles, and Mistra died again. In the year 1358 Dale reckoning, the overgod Io decreed that all deities, except Helm, the Vigilant, would be cast down from their divine realms and forced to walk Toril in mortal avatar forms. The reason was theft. Bane and Merkel had stolen the tablets of fate. Until the tablets were recovered, no deity would be allowed to return to the heavens. Mistra understood immediately what this meant for magic. Without her divine consciousness actively maintaining the weave, magic would begin to destabilize. So she went to the celestial stairway, the passage connecting the mortal world to the divine realms, and she tried to ascend back to her position. Helm stood in her way, the Vigilant One, whom Io had tasked with ensuring that no deity defied his decree. Mistra attempted to pass him, to return to the heavens. Helm struck her down. The goddess of magic died at the celestial stairway, her avatar body destroyed, her divine essence scattered. The weave began to fail immediately. The force of the weave was released into the land of Toril itself. Magic became wild and unpredictable during the time of troubles. Spells produced random, unpredictable effects. Magic became dangerous, unreliable, something to be avoided rather than embraced. But Mystra had prepared for this possibility. Before challenging Helm, she had knowingly placed much of her divine essence in an amulet. This amulet found its way to a mortal sorceress named Ariel Manx, who went by the adventuring name Midnight. She was not an exceptional wizard by Netherese standards, but she possessed something more important: the rightful claim to Mystra's power. Midnight traveled across a continent torn apart by divine conflict, accompanied by two other mortals who would themselves become gods. Kellum Verlion Spain, a cursed warrior. Cyric, a thief and assassin, whose ambition would eventually lead him to claim multiple divine portfolios. In Waterdeep, after Midnight played a key role in defeating Merkel, Io himself reached down and elevated her to godhood. She became Mystra, adopting the name to honor her predecessor, becoming the goddess of magic and guardian of the weave. This new Mystra was different from her predecessor. She had been mortal mere weeks before ascending to divinity. She remembered what it felt like to struggle with spells, to fail a casting, to run out of magical energy. This made her more approachable, more willing to answer prayers from common folk. She ruled for only 27 years. 27 years from 1358 Dale reckoning to 1385 Dale reckoning. In that brief period, she restored the weave, re-established the Church of Mystra, trained new chosen. She thought she had time. She was wrong. Cyric had become a god during the time of troubles. He claimed murder, death, strife, deception, and lies as his domains. And he had gone mad. Shar, goddess of darkness and loss, encouraged this madness. She wanted Mystra dead. The goddess of magic stood in opposition to everything Shar represented. On Tarsak 29 in the year of Blue Fire, 1385 Dale reckoning, Cyric, aided and abetted by Shar, murdered Mystra in her own divine realm of Dwimmerheart. Mystra's death was not clean. The weave that she controlled and oversaw burst, as did its counterpart, the Shadow Weave. This resulted in the spell plague spreading across the cosmos. Blue flames enveloped the realms and surrounding planes. These were not normal flames. They were raw, uncontrolled magical energy, freed from the constraints of the weave, burning through the fabric of reality itself. Anything these flames touched was transformed, mutated, destroyed. Entire nations were consumed. millions died instantly. Millions more were transformed into spell-scarred beings, mortals whose bodies and minds had been warped by exposure to wild magic. During the 10-year period that followed, magic was unreliable. In some cases, it had the opposite effect, had additional unintended effects, or affected others than the intended target. Often the spellcaster would be immolated in blue flame. In many cases, magic failed outright. Many magic items lost their power. Dwimmerheart, Mystra's divine realm, was utterly destroyed. Savras, god of divination, who made his divine realm within Dwimmerheart, was killed in the process. Azoth, god of wizards and Mystra's most loyal servant, was cast from the dying realm into the 9 hells, where Asmodeus captured him. For over a century, Faerun existed without a goddess of magic. The weave was gone. What remained was unstable and unpredictable. Then came the second sundering, and reality rewrote itself. Elminster Amur, one of Mystra's chosen who had survived through desperate means, played a crucial role in her return. He had absorbed silver fire from dying chosen, gathering fragments of Mystra's power. During the second sundering, he returned this power to Mystra in an event that became known as Mystra's Return. But it was not until 1487 Dale reckoning that the goddess was fully restored. As 1487 Dale reckoning came to a close, the second sundering ended with the full return of Mystra and the weave. Mystra gained full control over the weave once more, stopping Shar from turning it into a new shadow weave. Mystra healed the Forgotten Realms and removed any remaining traces of the spell plague. 3 deaths, 3 resurrections. Each time something changed. The weave that exists now is not the weave that Mistral maintained before Karsus's folly. The goddess who rules over magic today is not quite the same entity who died at Helm's hand, or who fell to Cyric's treachery. Magic itself has been rebuilt and reshaped so many times that scholars could reasonably debate whether it even qualifies as the same phenomenon anymore. The goddess of magic has proven that even essential deities can die, can fail, can be destroyed through violence or ambition, or simple bad timing. And yet magic survives. The weave endures. Mortals still cast spells, still reshape reality through will and words. The throne of magic has sat empty 3 times, and 3 times someone or something has filled it again, restoring what was lost, rebuilding what was destroyed. But each restoration costs something. Each resurrection brings changes that cannot be undone. And the question that haunts every scholar who studies these events is simple. What happens if Mystra dies a 4th time and no one is left to bring her back? Section 3. Bane, the god who conquered death. Some gods die and stay dead, Their corpses drift through the astral plane as warnings to others who might grow complacent. Their portfolios are claimed by rivals. Their worshippers scatter to other faiths or abandon religion entirely. But some gods plan for their own death with the same meticulous attention they devote to conquering nations, with the same ruthless cunning they apply to subjugating rivals. Bane, the Lord of Darkness, the Black Hand, the ultimate tyrant who believed that all of Faerun and the gods themselves should bow before him, died during the time of troubles. His avatar body was destroyed in battle, his divine essence scattered, his church fractured into competing factions. And 14 years later, on midwinter night in 1372 Dale Reckoning, he returned from death, bursting forth from the body of his own son, reclaiming his throne, and demonstrating that even true divine death can be overcome with sufficient preparation, absolute ruthlessness, and the willingness to sacrifice anything and anyone to achieve your goals. Bane was not always a god. He began as a mortal, though the details of his mortal life remain frustratingly vague. What is certain is that he was powerful, ambitious, and utterly devoid of mercy or compassion. At some point in history, three mortals formed an alliance. Bane, Baal, who would become the god of murder, Merkel, who would claim death and decay. Together, they called themselves adventurers, though that term inadequately describes what they actually were. According to the lore first explicitly published in Faiths and Avatars in 1996, these three evil mortals lusted after divine power and set their sights on claiming it through force. Their target was Jurgal, the ancient god who ruled over death, murder, strife, tyranny, and the recording of the names of the dead. Jurgal was unimaginably old, a deity who had existed since the earliest days of Faerun, who had accumulated power over millennia, who presided over one of the largest and most important portfolios in the entire pantheon. The three mortals fought their way through the gray waste, slaughtering everything in their path. Through armies of skeletons, legions of zombies, hordes of non-corporeal undead, and a gauntlet of liches they battled. Eventually, they reached the object of their lifelong quest, the Bone Throne. When they finally stood before Jurgal and demanded that he surrender his power, they expected resistance. They expected violence. They expected a conflict that would test every ability they possessed. Jurgal simply gave them what they wanted. According to the tale, Jurgal arose from his throne with a weary expression and said that the throne was theirs, that he had grown weary of this empty power. He offered to serve and guide them as their seneschal until they grew comfortable with the position. Bane, Baal, and Merkel were stunned. Violence erupted immediately as the three former allies became enemies, each attempting to claim all of Jurgal's power. Jurgil intervened and suggested they divide the portfolio and compete for the pieces through a game. The mortals agreed. Based on the account recorded in later sources, they decided to bowl skulls across the gray waste. Jurgil took the heads of his 3 most powerful liches and gave them to the trio. Bane's skull rolled the farthest. Baal came in second. Merkel finished last. But before they could claim their prizes, Maelor the Beast Lord arrived, having heard that divine power was being distributed. Jurgil suggested a game of knucklebones, using his own finger bones as dice to determine the final distribution. And importantly, they should finish before Maelor returned from chasing down the skulls. Bane won. He chose tyranny, strife, and hatred as his domains. He would be the god of conquest, of domination, of absolute power over others. Baal, who came in third, took murder and death. Merkel, who finished second, selected the dead, becoming lord over those who had already passed from life. Together, they were known as the Dark Three, though later events would earn them the name the Dead Three. Jurgil, content to finally be relieved of his burdens, became Merkel's seneschal, serving the god of death while maintaining some fragment of his former divinity. Bane claimed tyranny, and he embodied that portfolio with terrifying completeness. He was not a god who merely encouraged his followers to be cruel. He demanded absolute obedience, complete submission, total dedication. His church operated on principles of rigid hierarchy, where those above held absolute power over those below. Failure was punished with torture and death. Success was rewarded with opportunities to inflict torture and death on others. From his divine realm of Banehold, the Black Lord orchestrated plans that spanned centuries. He worked to dominate Faerun through his followers, establishing the Gentarim, a massive organization of merchants, mercenaries, mages, and assassins who spread Bane's influence across nations. But Bane was not content with dominating mortals. He wanted to dominate the gods themselves. He formed an alliance with Merkel, his former companion from their mortal days, and together they devised a plan so audacious that it bordered on insanity. They would steal the tablets of fate from Io himself, the overgod who set the rules by which all deities must operate. The theft succeeded. Bane and Merkel actually managed to steal the tablets of fate from the overgod. And then Io responded with a decree so absolute, so devastating, that it proved beyond any doubt who actually held ultimate power. All gods except Helm, the Vigilant, would be cast down from their divine realms and forced to walk Toril in mortal avatar forms. No exceptions, no negotiations. Until the tablets of fate were recovered and returned, every deity would experience mortality. This was the time of troubles, and it would claim the lives of multiple gods, including Bane himself. Bane's avatar walked Faerun as a massive, armored figure radiating malevolence and power. He gathered his followers, marshaled his forces, and marched toward the city of Tantras, where one of the tablets of fate was believed to be located. Torm stood in his way. The loyal Fury, the god who embodied duty, self-sacrifice, and unwavering commitment to justice, could not allow Bane to succeed. Torm, recognizing that his avatar form lacked the power to defeat Bane alone, called upon his worshippers to make the ultimate sacrifice. Thousands responded. Thousands of Torms, faithful, offered their lives to their god, and Torm absorbed their essence, transforming that sacrifice into power. On Elysi's 13, in the year 1358 Dale Reckoning, the two gods clashed in the harbor of Tantras in mutual destruction. The battle was so intense, so violent, that it created permanent effects in the area. When the battle ended, when the divine energies dissipated, and the survivors could finally see what remained, both gods were dead. Torm's avatar body was gone. Bane's avatar body was gone. Their divine essences had been cast into the astral plane, and both thrones stood empty. Torm would be resurrected by Io shortly after the time of troubles ended, rewarded for his sacrifice and his obedience. But Bane was supposed to stay dead. His portfolio was divided between Cyric, who had ascended to godhood during the time of troubles, and a demigod named Eotu Zavim, who was Bane's own half-demon son. Zavim presented himself as an independent deity of tyranny, ambition, and hate, much like his father, but with his own distinct identity. His symbol was different from Bane's. His teachings emphasized different aspects of tyranny. He was not trying to be Bane. He was trying to be himself, to establish his own identity as a god, to build his own church and his own power base. What Zavim did not know, what none of his worshippers suspected, was that he had been created for a single purpose. Based on what occurred later, this suggests Bane had hidden his divine essence within Zavim before the time of troubles, seeding a fragment of himself in his half-demon offspring. This interpretation is supported by what happened next. For 14 years, Zavim grew in power and influence. For 14 years, he answered prayers, granted divine spells to his clerics, built his church, accumulated worshippers. And the fragment of Bane hidden within him, if the theory is correct, grew stronger, fed by the worship Zavim received. On midwinter night in the year 1372 Dale Reckoning, all former priests of Bane and current worshippers of Zavim received a vision. They saw Eotu Zavim being consumed by hellish green flames. They saw Bane emerging from Zavim's corpse. They woke to find cold green flames enveloping their hands. the Lord of Darkness had returned from death through the simple expedient of hiding inside someone else until he was strong enough to take over. Significantly, only Zavim's faithful received this vision. Those who had remained faithful to Bane during his death, those who had converted to Cyric, they received no such revelation. Only Zavim's worshippers saw it, because they were the ones who needed to understand that their worship was now being redirected. Then came the purge. Sources suggest Bane launched what became known as the Bane Death, targeting those who had betrayed him during his absence. The church was rebuilt according to Bane's standards, though specific details of this purge remain unclear in the historical record. The resurrection was not perfect. Bane returned with less power than he had possessed before his death. The rules of divinity had changed during and after the time of troubles. Io had decreed that gods would derive their power directly from the number of worshippers they possessed and how well they maintained their portfolios. Bane had to rebuild his follower base, had to prove his relevance again. But he did rebuild. Over the decades and centuries following his resurrection, Bane grew in power. When the spell plague occurred and Mystra died, Bane survived largely unscathed. In fact, the cataclysm may have benefited him by removing rivals. During the century that followed the spell plague, according to some sources, Bane conquered the goblinoid pantheon. By the current era, Bane had regained much of his former power and danger. What does Bane's resurrection teach about the nature of divine death and empty thrones? It demonstrates that gods can prepare for their own destruction, that divine essence can potentially be hidden and preserved even when the god's primary body is destroyed. It shows that worship directed at one deity can be redirected to another if circumstances align correctly. And it proves that the throne of tyranny will never remain empty for long, because there will always be mortals who seek to dominate others, who embrace cruelty as a path to power. Bane is the god who conquered death through preparation, who potentially turned his own son into a vessel for his eventual resurrection, who demonstrated that even divine mortality can be overcome with sufficient ruthlessness. His empty throne lasted 14 years, and during that time, the forces of good must have hoped that Bane was truly gone. But hope is not a strategy. Bane returned, whether through contingency or through some other means. And one of his first acts was to ensure his followers understood that their God had never truly abandoned them. Section 4. Gilgim, the God King who lost everything. Some gods rule from distant divine realms, answering prayers through miracles, maintaining the barrier between mortal and divine. They are worshipped from afar, feared, and loved in equal measure. Present in their followers, lives only through the intermediary of clergy and holy symbols. But some gods walk among their people. They rule not through distant intervention, but through direct physical presence. They sit on mortal thrones in mortal cities and govern their nations with an iron fist backed by genuine divine power. Gilgim was such a god, the god king of Undr, who ruled his nation in person for over 2,000 years, who demanded absolute obedience from his people, who treated an entire civilization as his personal property. And when he died in 1358 Dale reckoning during the time of troubles, when Tiamat, the dragon queen, slew him in the streets of his own capital, his death proved that even gods who seem eternal, who have ruled unchanged for millennia, can be destroyed. Undr was one of the oldest human nations on Faerun, founded in the year -2637 Dale reckoning by refugees from another plane of existence. These refugees brought with them their gods, or rather, beings they called gods. The Unthuric pantheon consisted of powerful entities who were more akin to exceptionally mighty mortals than true deities in the traditional sense. Based on the historical record, Gilgim was originally the son of Enlil, the chief deity of the Unthuric pantheon. Over the centuries that followed the Orkgate Wars of -1071 Dale reckoning, the Unthuric pantheon suffered devastating losses. Multiple deities were killed during that conflict. Enlil, the chief god, abdicated in favor of his son Gilgim and vanished. This left Gilgim as the primary divine authority in Undr, and he would rule the nation directly for the next 2,103 years. But over millennia, through the worship of millions, through the accumulation of belief and prayer and sacrifice, Gilgim became a true god in the cosmological sense. He claimed war, conquest, and rulership as his domains. And he demanded worship not merely from temples, but from every aspect of Unthuric life. Gilgim did not govern through clergy or champions. He ruled directly. His palace stood in Unthalas, the capital of Undr, and from that palace he issued decrees that shaped every aspect of his nation's existence. He personally led armies into battle. He personally judged criminals and dissidents. He personally decided policy for his entire nation. To be a citizen of Undr was to live under the constant, immediate authority of a being who possessed the power of a god and the temperament of a tyrant. And he was a tyrant. The historical accounts are clear on this point. Gilgim was cruel, capricious, paranoid, and increasingly unstable as the centuries wore on. A formidable warrior, Gilgim was a poor politician, a disinterested administrator, and hopeless at discerning the needs of his subject worshippers. He began a 2,000-year deterioration into despotic tyranny as the ruler of Undr. The people of Undr lived in fear and resentment. For many centuries, Undr was prevented from complete collapse only by a strict social hierarchy and semi-competent bureaucrats who could administer the country with minimal interference. However, in the later centuries, both Gilgim and his church began to meddle more in areas outside their expertise, interfering with the country's economy and military organization, usually to their detriment. This was worship through coercion, faith maintained by threat of violence, a religious system built entirely on the foundation of terror. And when Gilgim showed weakness, when circumstances stripped him of the invincibility that had protected him, his people did not rush to his defense. The time of troubles came in 1358 Dale Reckoning, and Gilgim found himself in avatar form, stripped of most of his divine power, vulnerable in ways he had not experienced since before he became a god. The overgod Io had decreed that all gods except Helm would walk Toril as mortals until the stolen tablets of fate were recovered. Tiamat had been planning her move. The Dragon Queen had been a sworn enemy of the Unthuric pantheon for millennia. She had been effectively destroyed by Bahamut under his Unthuric name Marduk during the Battle of the Gods at the conclusion of the Orkgate Wars. But Tiamat had returned, reinvigorated. Her worship spread across multiple nations through cults and allied organizations. By the time of troubles, Tiamat's cult had propelled her worship to the rank of a lesser power, while Gilgim's incompetence and unpopularity had reduced him to the rank of a demigod. In 1358 Dale Reckoning, during the Year of Shadows, Tiamat descended on Unthalas and engaged Gilgim in a titanic battle. The conflict occurred in the streets of Gilgim's own capital, in sight of the palace from which he had ruled for over 2 millennia. The battle destroyed much of Unthalas. Buildings collapsed. Fires spread through entire districts. Thousands of civilians died, caught in the crossfire of combat between God and Dragon Goddess. When the battle finally ended, Gilgim was dead. Tiamat had won, slaying the God King in his own city. The god who had ruled Undr for over 2,000 years, who had seemed eternal and unchangeable, was destroyed in a single afternoon. Gilgim's death saw the dissolution of what remained of the Unthuric pantheon. His throne, both the mortal throne in Unthalas and the divine throne he had occupied as a god, sat empty. And Undr, the nation that had existed under his rule for millennia, discovered what happens when the only unifying force holding a civilization together suddenly vanishes. Chaos erupted immediately. Unthalas itself had been devastated in the battle with Tiamat. Civil control of the city had collapsed. Without Gilgim, Undr had no central authority. The God King had not established any meaningful system of succession because he never expected to die. Riots erupted throughout Undr. the empire fell into chaos. Different factions claimed power, each insisting they represented legitimate authority. But none possessed the power to enforce their claims. Then Mulhorand invaded. At the start of 1371 Dale Reckoning, Mulhorand sent troops across the border into Undr, officially citing concerns about trade disruption and security. In reality, Undr's ancient rival recognized an opportunity. Mulhorandi armies swept across the border, conquering Unthuric territory with ease. Within years, Mulhorand had conquered most of Undr. Only the northern wizards, protectors of Mesemprar, managed to hold back the invaders from northern Undr and ruled that region. The people of Undr found themselves living under new rulers. For some, this was liberation. They had hated Gilgeim, had suffered under his tyranny. But others felt lost, their entire civilization erased. For over a century, Undr ceased to exist as an independent nation in its traditional form. The territory that had once been Undr was divided. The culture that had defined Undr for nearly 3,000 years was systematically erased or transformed. Gilgeim's empty throne was not merely vacant. It had been demolished, scattered, seemingly forgotten. Then came the Second Sundering, and reality rewrote itself once again. During the Spell Plague in 1385 Dale Reckoning, Undr had been exchanged with a corresponding location on the world of Aber. While on Aber, Undr had succumbed to the domination of creatures native to that world. But something remarkable occurred during Undr's time on Aber. A reincarnated Gilgeim appeared and led his people against their new oppressors. In 1486 Dale Reckoning, during the Second Sundering, Undr was returned to Toril by the cosmic processes reshaping reality. A second incarnation of Gilgeim was seen again in Undr. Whether this was the same Gilgeim who had died in 1358, or a true reincarnation, or something else entirely, remains unclear. Once Undr returned to Toril, Gilgeim immediately went to war against the dragon-born nation of Tymenthr, which had appeared in Undr's former territory during the Spell Plague. This started the First Tymenthr-Undr War, as Gilgeim sought to reclaim all of Undr's ancestral land. But this Gilgeim returned to an Undr that had changed. The nation had been restored by the Second Sundering, but the people who populated it were not the same people who had lived under Gilgeim's original rule. Many were descendants of those who had survived on Aber, who had been led by this reincarnated Gilgeim against oppressors there. The relationship between this returned God-King and his people remained complex and uncertain. The story of Gilgeim demonstrates what happens when a god builds their entire existence around direct personal rule, when divinity becomes synonymous with political authority. When such a god dies, They do not leave behind a church that can maintain their worship. They do not leave clergy who can interpret their will. They leave a power vacuum, a catastrophic failure of the entire system upon which their civilization was built. His empty throne lasted over a century in one sense, though the cosmic reshuffling of the spell plague and second sundering complicates the timeline. The God King who had seemed eternal, who had ruled unchanged for over 2,000 years, was proven mortal in the most definitive way possible. And when he returned, when the second sundering restored him in some form, he discovered that resurrection does not undo consequences, that empty thrones create changes that persist even after someone sits in them again. Section 5. The Eternal Cycle of Empty Thrones. You have walked through the graveyard of gods. You have seen Mistra die 3 times, each death tearing magic apart, each resurrection bringing something changed and imperfect. You have witnessed Bane conquer death itself through ruthless planning and the sacrifice of his own son. You have stood in the ruins of Unther as Gilgeim's 2,000-year reign ended in a single afternoon of violence. And now you stand at the edge of understanding, looking out across the multiverse, seeing patterns that repeat across worlds and pantheons, recognizing the fundamental truth that shapes divine existence. No throne remains empty forever, and no occupant remains seated eternally. The gods of Dungeons and Dragons exist within cycles. They rise through accumulation of worship, through mortal ascension, through the absorption of portfolios from fallen predecessors. They reign for centuries or millennia, answering prayers, performing miracles, shaping reality according to their nature and purpose. They compete with other deities for worshippers, for relevance, for the continued belief that sustains their existence, at least in cosmological frameworks where worship directly fuels divine power. And eventually, inevitably, some of them fall. They die in battle with other gods. They fade as worship declines. They are murdered by ambitious rivals or betrayed by their own servants. They grow obsolete as the world changes around them, and they cannot adapt quickly enough to remain relevant. When a god falls, when that throne sits empty, reality does not simply pause and wait for someone to fill it. The portfolios that God governed, those fundamental aspects of existence like war or magic, or harvest or death, continue to exist. Mortals still fight wars. Wizards still cast spells. Farmers still plant crops. Souls still depart from life and require processing. The functions a god performed must be maintained by someone or something, because reality itself depends on those functions continuing. Sometimes the transition is orderly and planned. Jurgil, the ancient god of endings, simply gave his portfolio away to Bane, Baal, and Merkel when he grew weary of existence. The 3 mortals who came to kill him found him willing to surrender, eager even to be relieved of responsibilities he had carried for eons. The throne of endings did not sit empty for even a moment. Power transferred directly from the old god to the new gods, divided among them according to the results of games played with skulls and knuckle bones. This represents divine succession at its most efficient, a transfer of authority that prevented the chaos that usually follows divine death. But such orderly transitions are rare. Far more common is the violent scramble that follows unexpected divine death. When Mystra died during the time of troubles, when Helm struck her down at the celestial stairway, the portfolio of magic was claimed quickly. Midnight possessed the legitimate claim, the fragment of Mystra's essence that the dying goddess had passed to her, and Io himself elevated her to godhood to fill the empty throne before the situation deteriorated further. The speed matters. The longer a divine throne sits empty, the more chaos erupts in the domains that God governed. Magic became wild and unpredictable during the time of troubles because Mystra was absent. This suggests that the mechanisms of reality require constant divine oversight in many Dungeons and Dragons cosmologies. And when that oversight lapses, consequences affect millions of mortals. This creates pressure for empty thrones to be filled quickly. Sometimes this means another god expands their domain, absorbing the fallen deity's responsibilities into their existing portfolio. According to the lore, those whose portfolios conflicted with an existing deity in the Forgotten Realms were either absorbed into the existing deity or may have contested for the power of their worshippers. Within a sphere of influence or pantheon, no two gods can have overlapping portfolios without some form of resolution occurring. When Ibrindal died during the time of troubles, devoured by Shar, his domains were absorbed into Shar's existing portfolio. The transition was violent but quick. Based on accounts from that era, Ibrindal's worshippers found themselves redirected to Shar, their faith claimed by a goddess they had not chosen. Other times, mortal ascension fills the void. When Merkel died, a mortal named Kelimver ascended to become the new god of death. When Io elevated him to godhood, Kelimver brought mortal sensibilities to divine judgment. He reformed the entire system of how souls are processed in the Forgotten Realms. The throne of death was filled by someone who had experienced mortality, who remembered what it felt like to fear death. Based on what scholars observe across different campaign settings, new gods can sometimes spontaneously generate from accumulated belief. When enough mortals believe in a concept, when enough worship flows toward an idea, even if no specific deity claims it, divine power could potentially coalesce into consciousness. This interpretation would explain how some quasi-deities and demigods emerge not from mortal ascension or divine appointment, but from collective faith-seeking expression. The pattern of divine death and succession repeats across campaign settings. In Dragonlance, when Takhisis died, her role in the pantheon eventually required filling. In other settings, when gods fall, their responsibilities are absorbed by survivors or claimed by newcomers. Even in Athas, where true gods do not exist, the impulse to worship manifests in the cults surrounding sorcerer kings. What this reveals is that the empty throne is not truly a void. It is a temporary state, an unstable configuration that forces within the cosmology work to resolve. The throne may sit unoccupied for moments, for years, rarely for centuries. But eventually, someone sits down, claims the power, accepts the responsibilities. The alternative, a permanent empty throne where essential divine functions simply cease, would result in the collapse of systems that allow mortal civilization to function. Consider what makes a god relevant in the first place. In cosmological frameworks where gods depend on worship, it is not merely power, though power certainly helps. It is not simply having worshippers, though worship may be essential for maintaining divine existence in certain eras. Relevance comes from embodying something that mortals need or engage with, something fundamental to how they understand and interact with reality. A god of agriculture remains relevant as long as mortals depend on farming to survive. A god of war remains relevant as long as nations fight each other. A god of death remains eternally relevant because mortality itself guarantees that souls will always need processing. But a god of something obsolete, something that no longer matters to mortal existence, could face declining worship and fading power in cosmologies where worship directly sustains divinity. This helps explain why Mistra has survived 3 deaths, while other gods remain permanently deceased. Magic is fundamental to the Forgotten Realms. Civilization depends on it. Mortals organize their entire lives around access to arcane and divine power. A world without the goddess of magic, without someone maintaining the weave, cannot function as the Forgotten Realms is meant to function. So when Mistra dies, cosmic forces create pressure for her resurrection, for someone or something to claim her portfolio and restore the systems upon which millions depend. Bane returned because tyranny, as a concept, never goes out of style. As long as some mortals seek power over others, as long as nations conquer their neighbors, as long as individuals find purpose in domination, the portfolio of tyranny maintains relevance. Bane could have stayed dead. His portfolios could have remained divided between Cyric and Zavim. But Bane had prepared for his own resurrection, and the fundamental nature of what he represented ensured that when he returned, worshippers would be available. Gilgeim's return occurred as part of the Second Sundering's larger cosmic realignment. Reality rewriting itself to undo changes from the Spellplague era. Whether his return will be permanent, whether he can maintain relevance in a nation that learned to survive without him, remains uncertain. His throne is occupied again, but the occupation appears conditional, dependent on his ability to prove his continued relevance. The future of divinity in Dungeons and Dragons involves this constant tension between permanence and change. Gods want to believe they are eternal, that their thrones are secure, that their worshippers will remain faithful forever. But the evidence contradicts this belief repeatedly. Divine corpses drift through the astral plane by the dozens. Pantheons shift and evolve as old gods die and new gods ascend. Portfolios are traded, absorbed, divided, reclaimed in cycles that span centuries, but never truly end. You might wonder whether this cycle could break entirely, whether some catastrophe could kill all the gods simultaneously and leave reality devoid of divine presence. The Spellplague came close when it killed Mystra and disrupted divine power across the multiverse. If something killed multiple greater deities simultaneously, if the divine realms collapsed all at once, the results would be catastrophic beyond measure. But even in that scenario, the pattern would likely reassert itself in some form. Based on what we observe, mortals continue to worship, to pray, to seek higher powers, even in the absence of gods. That accumulated belief could potentially generate new gods, perhaps different from the old gods, perhaps operating according to different rules, but still divine entities who fill the empty thrones and perform the functions that reality requires. Athos demonstrates the exception, the one major setting where gods genuinely do not exist, and mortals have adapted to their absence. But even Athos shows the pattern reasserting itself in modified form. The Sorcerer Kings are not true deities, but they occupy the niche that gods would fill. They demand worship. They present themselves as entities beyond mortal limitation. The form is different, but the function remains eerily similar to what gods provide in other worlds. What does all this mean for mortals living in these worlds? For adventurers who might witness divine death firsthand? For clerics whose power depends on gods, who might not be as eternal as they claim? It means uncertainty is fundamental to divine relationships. The God you worship today might die tomorrow. The power you channel through prayer might suddenly cease if your deity falls in battle or fades from irrelevance. But it also means opportunity. Empty thrones can be filled by mortals who prove themselves worthy. Divine ascension is not merely theoretical. It happens. Midnight rose from mortal sorceress to goddess of magic. Kelimver ascended from cursed warrior to god of death. The path to godhood is dangerous, certainly requiring power and cunning and extraordinary circumstances. But it is possible, and that possibility drives mortal ambition in ways that a truly unchangeable divine hierarchy never could. The empty throne is not an ending. It is a transition, a moment between one divine reign and the next, a brief period of chaos and opportunity where the fundamental nature of reality becomes fluid and changeable. Some thrones remain empty for only moments before new occupants claim them. Others sit vacant for years or decades. Rarely, a throne might remain empty for centuries, its portfolios absorbed by other gods, its worshippers scattered to other faiths. But even then, circumstances can change, belief can resurge, and someone new can claim what was thought lost forever. You have seen the pattern now. You understand the cycle. Gods rise from mortality or from other gods' deaths. They accumulate power through worship in eras and cosmologies where such mechanics apply. They maintain their relevance through adaptation and engagement with mortal concerns. They compete with rivals for followers and portfolios. They eventually fall through violence or obsolescence or catastrophic circumstances. Their thrones sit empty until someone claims them. And the cycle continues, eternal not in any individual god, but in the endless process of divine birth, divine life, divine death, and divine replacement. The astral plane will continue accumulating divine corpses. The Githyanki will continue building their cities upon dead gods' bodies. Adventurers will continue venturing into those corpses, seeking treasures and artifacts. And through it all, the empty thrones will be filled, one, by entities willing to accept the responsibilities and the risks that come with divinity. This is the truth of divine mortality in Dungeons and Dragons. This is the reality of empty thrones. They are not permanent voids, but temporary states in an eternal cycle. They are warnings to current gods that relevance is survival and obsolescence is death. They are opportunities for ambitious mortals who seek apotheosis. They are transitions that reshape pantheons and redirect worship. And they are, ultimately, proof that even immortality has conditions. Even divinity has limits. Even the most powerful beings in the multiverse must adapt or perish. If you have found value in this journey through divine death and resurrection, if you have gained understanding of what happens when gods fail and thrones sit empty, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. There are more stories to tell, more lore to explore, more truths about the nature of divinity and mortality waiting to be shared. Until next time, may your gods remain relevant, your worship remain meaningful, and your own throne, whatever form it takes, remain occupied by someone worthy of sitting there.